Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight for this wonderful webinar. I'm Annamarie Francois, a former public school teacher and administrator, and currently the executive director of UCLA Center X. I have the great privilege of moderating tonight's discussion. The purpose of tonight's webinar is to engage educational activists in a critical conversation that explores what educators can do to promote and sustain equity for those furthest away from it. What a timely discussion to have. We will frame tonight's conversation around three essential questions. First, how do we intentionally build equity into our schools? How can we discuss race and anti-racism with teachers, students, administrators, and parents, particularly in our current socio-political context? And how do we promote broad-based alliances to promote equity? During our hour together, please raise your questions in the chat, as we will have time at the end of the discussion to take up some of those questions. Before we get started, I'd also like to mention and thank our co-sponsors, the UCLA Graduate School of Education and Information Studies and the UCLA Women's School Leadership Academy, a leadership development initiative for women school leaders with the courage to lead for justice in critical times such as these. So let's get started. Joining us this evening are three educational justice activists who together represent public and charter schools and districts, the nonprofit sector, and institutions of higher education. Our first panelist is Anthony Jackson. Mr. Jackson is Director of Community Schools Transformation in the Los Angeles Unified School District, Local District West. In that capacity, he leads principals in advancing the responsive transformation of their schools to empower and elevate learning outcomes for African American and Latinx students. Mr. Jackson was a teacher at 99th Street School in Watt before becoming principal at Hillcrest Drive Elementary School and Music Magnet in the Los Angeles Unified School District, and at Aspire Slauson Academy, a K-6 charter school also in Los Angeles. Most of you probably remember Mr. Jackson as founder and co-director of Culture and Language Academy of Success, a renowned LA charter school committed to educating underserved students using culturally and linguistically responsive pedagogy. In addition to the various school leadership positions Mr. Jackson has held in public education, he also served as a coordinator of elementary literacy, an instructional specialist, and an instructional technology coordinator in the LAUSD. Mr. Jackson is currently a doctoral student at UCLA's Graduate School of Education and Information Studies. Our second panelist is Dr. Caprice Young, National Superintendent of Learn for Life Schools. Learn for Life Schools serves more than 45,000 students in more than 85 learning centers in California, Ohio, and Michigan. Raised in a host foster family, she identifies with and has committed her life to supporting Opportunity Youth. Dr. Young left IBM in 1999 to serve as a member and president of the elected Los Angeles School Board, and in 2003, she founded the California Charter Schools Association. Since 2008, she has provided executive leadership to a range of education, philanthropy, nonprofit, and business organizations undergoing major transformation. She is recipient of the Coral Crystal Eagle for Excellence in Public Service, the California State University Los Angeles Educator of the Year Award in 2016, and she is an inductee to the National Charter School Hall of Fame. Dr. Young serves on the board of several organizations, including the Fordham Foundation and Savvy Source, and has been an adjunct faculty member of the UCLA Graduate School of Education and Information Studies Educational Leadership Program. And finally, we are joined by Dr. Kenneth Magdaleno, founder, president, CEO of Center for Leadership, Equity, and Research. Many of you know it as CLEAR, a nonprofit active in the Central Valley and throughout the state of California since 2011. CLEAR's primary goals are the development of social justice educational leaders, the growth and retention of leaders of color through coaching and mentoring, addressing equity issues through the educational system, and researching the impact of positive leadership models on underrepresented groups. Mr. Magdaleno, or Dr. Magdaleno, excuse me, has been described as an equity warrior, and I can attest to that, and regularly speaks and consults on matters of equity and leadership. Dr. Magdaleno most recently served as director of the doctoral program in educational leadership at California State University, Fresno, and also served as department chair of the master's program in educational leadership. Prior to entering higher education, Dr. Magdaleno served the students of California as an elementary school principal, middle school teacher, assistant principal and principal, high school teacher, coach, and guidance counselor. Your panel has done a lot in very short lives. So that's who the panelists are on paper. And I'd like to start the conversation by offering the audience a more personal peek into their interest in being here tonight and why they want to engage with you for the next hour. So I'd like to raise the following question to all three of you. And it's a simple one. What brings you to this work? Let's start with you, Anthony Jackson.
Thanks, Annamarie, and welcome to all our attendees, participants in this, and also big shout out to my co-panelists. You guys are amazing. I got in this work basically to change the world. You know, I had some other jobs before I became an educator. And if I may share, you know, I was a RTD bus driver, it's now called Metro, believe it or not. Was an Arrowhead delivery bottled water salesman, delivered water to LAUSD, as a matter of fact. That was an interesting part. And both of those obviously are in other lives, but I got in this work basically to truly change the world, even if it meant doing so 30 students or 24 students at a time in classrooms. One of my favorite authors, Kiese Lehman, he says that, thank you to all the teachers in the world, daring to teach with the love, patience, honesty, imagination, and rigor, right? That you likely did not experience as a student. And I think that's really important. But Bettina Love talks about spirit murder in classrooms. And I've always referred to microaggressions in the classroom as tiny murders rooted in like dehumanizing classroom pedagogies, and really just all about trying to create a better world by eliminating those in the classroom.
Thanks, Anthony. We're so happy that you're here. Dr. Young, what brings you to this work?
Well, I was going to say something different, but when Anthony said that he started as a bus driver, I'm willing to bet that at the same time as you were bus driver at RTD, I was the budget director over at the LACPC, which were the two organizations that merged to create Metro, which proves that if you really want to go into education, you have to start in transportation. But actually, the reason why I'm here is that, as Annamarie said, I grew up in a foster family, and my parents, my biological parents, were the foster parents. So over the course of my life, I've had 36 brothers and sisters, and we had the boys' room, the girls' room, the parents' loft, and the clay room. My mom was a teacher and a sculptor, and my dad was a juvenile probation officer and eventually a minister. And so I grew up in one of those households where it was just everybody all the time. And I learned to love deeply and quickly, because you just never knew how long you were going to get these brothers and sisters for. And I ran for the school board because I was on the board of a home for abused and neglected kids, and the foster kids that we were serving were really getting the short end of things. And I haven't left education since. And it's because I care about the students that I serve as my brothers and sisters. We're
glad that you haven't left the field of education. And lastly, Ken Magdaleno, Dr. Kenny, what brings you to this work?
Well, it's interesting. I didn't drive a bus, and I definitely didn't do budget. However, I managed a packing house, and I drove a forklift. And I returned to school at the age of 38 to start my second year of college. And for that reason, I always say that everyone in their own time, that no one knows the journey that we're on. What brought me to this work especially was growing up in the 50s and 60s. It was not unusual to hear of microaggressions of dirty Mexican, go back to Mexico. And during those times, everyone really who can now use the terms Latino, Latinx, Chicano, were all called Mexican. And it was very troubling, and it was hurtful. It was hurtful because I was born here in the United States. And so that occurred, but the tipping point was really when I was 15 years old. I met a young girl who was really pretty. And at the time, we used to call it going steady, and people always make fun of me because I don't know what they call it now. But she was my girlfriend, but I couldn't walk her home. And I didn't understand why until a friend of hers told me that her parents didn't like Mexicans. And until that time, I had never really seen myself in that position, that being seen less than because of what I looked like. And so we ended up staying together. We were married when I was 19 and she was 18. Her parents never attended the wedding, did not attend the wedding, and I was not allowed in the house until I returned from serving overseas in the military. And I took an oath at that point in time that I would never allow myself to be seen as less than or second class. And in the journey of my life and being a leader in most of the areas that I've been in, I've always used leadership and mentoring leaders to remind them that we are valued and that we are not second class. And so the work that I do in equity, social justice, is all about dignity and respect. And so that's why I do this work.
I think that's a really great segue to our first question. But I also want to acknowledge to you all and for the audience that one of the reasons we go to the personal, why you are here, is because you can't really disentangle who you are when you come into the work and your why to how you go about doing it as an educator, as an educational leader. And so I just want to thank you for sharing just a little tidbit of your story, because it really grounds who you are as educational leaders in this work. So Ken, you talked about your story of having to face, in this case, racial injustice and your commitment to equity as a result. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you intentionally build a focus on equity into our schools and our educational system? And in particular, what in your experience has worked, why, and what did you learn from the process?
Yeah, as you noted, I've served from preschool to doctoral programs, which has been a wonderful opportunity. But in that time, as much as people want to believe that equity is present, I find that equity is actually a real challenge for the system. It is not only an educational problem, but it's a societal issue. And so, you know, most often people who are in education take a look at equity and they use it or align it with the term fairness. Well, in my experience, that does not occur enough. It's not about being fair. Every child should have that educational experience that gives them the access and the equity, or at least make the starting line even. Give us a shot, give them a shot. And that is really what I have tried to do over the years. And there are two areas that I really believe can influence what we do and how we develop equity in our schools. And one of those is mentoring. I have, over the years, have sponsored middle school mentoring programs, have developed, I will say, I'll give a shout out to UCLA, my dissertation, Lending a Helping Hand, Mentoring Latina and Latino Leaders into the 21st Century, was at work immediately after my final exam, my final oral. And so that particular program is now in its 17th cohort.
Wow.
There were some things that were part of that cohort, part of the development of that particular program that we could use in our schools. And as I indicated, part of that is recognizing our own ethnic and cultural value, not believing the deficit thinking that so many of us had heard in schools or in the communities as we grew up. And those of us that were in the initial development of the program were some of the strongest educational leaders in the state of California. And our real foundation that can be used in schools is the absolute changing the narrative, changing the narrative of who we are. Daniel Solorzano, who's at UCLA, he was on my committee, and one of the best articles that I've ever read of his that was most fruitful was that of counter storytelling. Being able to tell our stories to the young people that are coming after us. Being able to clear the road, so to speak, for those young people that come after us. When I would go to a school to visit, the kids would be so excited in the Central Valley because they were sometimes 99% Latino that they thought I was going to be their principal. And I would say, no, mija, no, mijo, I'm here visiting. But it's the role modeling. It's the role modeling that we as people of color need to do for our kids. We need to provide those role models because I sincerely believe that kids see the possibility for themselves and the adults that are around them. And if they don't see adults around them that look like them, they don't see that as a possibility. So developing that mentoring program was all about increasing the numbers in leadership. So today, I continue to develop and guide and support leaders of color so that they can become assistant principals, directors, assistant superintendents, and superintendents. And we've been very successful in doing that. So leadership is a key point of what we do. And I believe that the foundation of power, because at the end of the day, it is about power. The more of us there are, that remember where we came from, the better off we are and better off our kids will be.
So can you speak well about the importance of mentoring and amongst leadership? And the mentors that you speak of are folks just like you, just like Dr. Young, just like Mr. Jackson, who have been in the work for a long time. And one of the questions that we've received from the audience has to do with racial battle fatigue. You've been in it for a long time. We've been working hard together individually and as a collective to change the course of particularly racial injustice in our schools. What advice would you give to other leaders like you on how to stem the racial battle fatigue that comes with your own work in the struggle, but also mentoring others as they engage in the struggle?
I think there's a recognition, of course, that racial battle fatigue occurs. It happens. I've burned out a couple of times, to be honest. And my wife took me to Ireland in one case, and the other we went to Costa Rica, because it lives with us all of the time. I tell people that when I wake up every day, I have to prove that I belong. And so that fatigue absolutely is current. What I would say, one of the very first thing is get your own support system. Don't try to do the work by yourself, because it is lonely, it is hard, it is tiring, and sometimes you just want to go away. But if you have a support system, I have been meeting with the same Latino friends of mine since the year right around 2000, throughout the doctoral program, and since. We meet every Friday morning. We do it on video now, on Zoom. You need your own support system. Don't try to do the work. And my friends treat me with the disrespect that they think I deserve. And I believe that that's important also. Get away from that core group of fighting for justice, and get with some people who just want to and allow you to be you. Yeah. But the most important part is get your own support system. If you don't have one, call me, I'll help you.
Okay, thank you. And I want to thank Jacqueline Sims for submitting that question. I think so many of us in this work experience the kind of battle fatigue that that Kenny talks about, and it is about the support that we receive from one another that keeps us in the struggle in productive ways. So thank you so much for that. Anthony, welcome back, Mr. Jackson. We missed you.
Oh my goodness.
Oh
my goodness. I had to switch, went to my work laptop instead of my personal one. I'm not sure what happened.
That's okay. We were just talking a little bit about mentoring, and I wanted to move to the next question. And I have another question for you related to mentoring within the context of racism and anti-racism. So from your perspective, how might we discuss race and racism with teachers, students, administrators, and parents? And how have you shaped these conversations in your engagements with these groups, both at the institutional, individual, and systemic level?
Yeah, that's a great question, Emery. You know, my attempts at framing discussions around race have taken a fairly circuitous journey. I started basically just trying to do it on my own. I can remember in my fifth grade students at 99th Street School, we had some really great conversations. Happened to actually be teaching fifth grade to some really wonderful children during the Rodney King incident and the civil unrest that followed. And some of my students, obviously, because we were in Watts, they had experiences. They came with brand new sneakers once school reopened. And so we had conversations about it. And I've always found it much easier, especially in schools with brown and black and brown youngsters, to have those conversations far easier than it was to have, those follow-up conversations with our colleagues, right? And many of whom were white. I think that what I've attempted to do is then basically soften my approach, because I wasn't always successful with my colleagues and others and teachers that I was working with. So I went into this safe mode, right? Kind of rooted in examining implicit bias, and to a lesser extent, stereotype threat, whistling Vivaldi, Claude Steele's work, and found that to be okay. And I stuck with that for about 4 or 5 years, but it really wasn't really successful, because I think it did some things, and I'm going to mention racial equity detours Paul Gorski has identified. And I think that that approach, especially implicit bias, represents one of those detours, or it can, because it allows you to avoid actually dealing with issues of race. I mean, you can talk about implicit bias without talking about race. And oftentimes that's exactly what happened. So fast forward to 2019, and here comes Ibram X. Kendi with How to Be an Anti-Racist, following up on Stamp from the Beginning, and really providing, I think, a real like a clarity around how we might, first of all, think about racism and anti-racism, and then engage in some of that work. And so I think the big thing that he provided for me was moving from, he talks about, you're not focusing on people, but, you know, shifting to policy, right? And specifically racist policy. You know, he says racist policy doesn't necessarily like the term systemic racism, thinks it's redundant, but I like to use systemic racism because I think it frames the conversation around systems. And I think that's where we can really make a lot of inroads in terms of dealing with systems. And so there's a statement: every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. I forget who the author is. I never forget it though. And I think it's like basically white supremacy telling on itself, right? I mean, this is what you're going to get. I mean, in this system. And so as you begin to look at systems, you see exactly how interconnected those systems are around systemic racism. There is housing and restrictive covenants, redlining, right? Banking and lending practices related to that, the healthcare, environmental racism. We look at Flint, Michigan, voter suppression through voter ID laws, and you know, then the judiciary system and sentencing laws, and the penal system and mass incarceration. Shout out to Michelle Alexander and the new Jim Crow. And then, you know, of course, then there's education. Now, the thing about education is that it allows us to do cross-disciplinary work. We can go into all of those things and educate about them. But education is complicit because we fail to tell that story. We stick to basically a single story in terms of our textbooks and in terms of what teachers typically choose to cover. And so, you know, and I'm complicit as well. And I have to think about how is it that I am trying to change that, bringing in alternative texts, alternative curriculum, talking to curriculum designers about not telling single stories, you know, shout out to, you know, Chimamanda Adichie. And so in a sense, you know, it's work that's always in development. The most successful experience I've recently had, I did not facilitate, I was a participant, and it was the Summer Institute for LAUSD Local District West Principals. And two of my colleagues, you know, Carmina Nacorda and Autry Street, they did a fabulous job using Paul Gorski's article, Avoiding Racial Equity Detours, and went through it. And all I can say is I think the time is right. First of all, it's a great time to be able to have these conversations. I think it's a little less difficult to have these difficult conversations in the current climate. People want to talk about them. All I remember is everybody raving, and I did too, about the context of and how they shaped the conversation, and saying, unfortunately, an hour wasn't enough. We needed a half a day or maybe a full day to really engage in the conversation in the way that they presented it. It was really wonderful. And so I think, you know, I think it's really important to think about what are those detours that keep us from going all in terms of having the conversations with you know, adults in our school communities or in our broader communities. And then finally, you know, I say I've learned some lessons as well. And this is super important because there are some of us who just simply can't be saved. And I'm thinking of Caprice, your comments yesterday, right? And so to even bring up the subject of race and racism and anti-racism places them in a place and a space that really kind of just, you know, it's just too difficult for a facilitator to navigate in many ways. And, you know, I'm thinking of a teacher last year who shared with my wife. My wife's a principal, and the teacher shared with her as they were about to dive into a PD on culturally and linguistically responsive pedagogy, mind you, not necessarily even having to really talk about race, right? They went into this conversation, and a colleague told the teacher who shared with my wife, get ready to be called a racist, right? And I'm not sure what you do with that. You know, it's like, man, you know, I think that, you know, and I have to work through what would be a response to that, because I think it's super important to have one, because that's not the point at all, right? Mm-hmm. I know that for me, it's about bringing up, you know, the systems piece and staying there rather than focusing on people, because I think it allows us to make progress in the conversation. But I do bring that up to bring one point, the usefulness of allies and you know, what Bettina Loves calls co-conspirators, right? To have somebody who's willing to come back and let you know, this is what's being said around, you know, in a parking lot conversation, right? I mean, or after work. And I think it's really important. I've had allies who were able to bring back to me things that were being said too. And sometimes it was really powerful to have conversations around these anonymous statements that were occurring within the school community that were clearly racist, and but not attributing them to anybody. We got to deal with the idea like it's hanging up in the sky just as an idea by itself, right? Not connected to anyone in the room. And I think that also allows us to go deeper into addressing it, interrogating and examining it. And you know, I think that's super important. And then, you know, obviously book study is a big way for me to deal with my school communities, trying to read books that allow us to go deep into it and again, you know, hopefully change the world just a little bit.
Yeah, I appreciate the specificity of the kind of actions, the equity actions that we should be taking individually and collectively. You started out your response by talking about the LA uprising in response to the Rodney King verdict, and you being a teacher at that time. And that uprising actually was the impetus for the beginning of Center X at UCLA. So I think about this a lot. And one of our audience members asked the question, so what do you see as the similarities and differences between the LA Rebellion and the rebellions of today?
Good
From
question.
a leadership perspective in particular, I would say.
Yeah, so that's a great question. You know, I go all the way back to, you know, Eula Love in Los Angeles, who, you know, was, you know, shot dead for wielding a knife at LAPD. I was actually a student at UCLA at the time, editor of the Black Student News magazine, and you know, we did a piece on that. And so, you know, I attempted to create connections between, you know, such incidents. There would be, you know, Eula Love, and then obviously Rodney King, which, you know, we all got to see, you know, and it's the first time I think, you know, I mean, and that wasn't a cell phone. That was somebody had a real video camera, probably, you know, a brick on their shoulder trying to film that. But it was really super important to capture that, because I think it opened up just a sense for people exactly what is occurring out in, you know, in the streets of Los Angeles or anywhere else around the world, and specifically in the United States. I think there were some similarities in terms of what we witnessed, the sheer dehumanization of an individual. In this instance, a Black man, although I don't want to limit it, because, you know, there are a number of, thinking of Breonna Taylor, thinking of Sandra Bland, there have been women who have also been victims of that kind of dehumanizing sort of way in which law enforcement, you know, interacts with you know, Black and brown folk in their communities. And so I see that connection. I think the big difference for me is the response. Just this, we're having this, you know, this reckoning right now, this historical reckoning in a way that did not occur. As a matter of fact, I can remember being out driving around, seeing the damage that was done in my community and other communities in South Los Angeles. And I can remember also watching the news and recognizing most of the people out rioting, the protesters, were Black, right? I just remember that. That was not the case this time around. So when we talk about, you know, this reckoning, it seemed to be not only, you know, Black folks who had enough around George Floyd's murder, but, you know, other people too. And I think that's really important, because I think it's opened up, you know, you know, our country, our society, to have these conversations that typically had been sort of closed, right? And I mean, not that they weren't occurring, but not in the way that they're occurring now. And I think it's been you know, it just, I tell people, man, what a time to be alive. You know, we can actually have these conversations.
And what the other thing that strikes me is, as an educational leader, is that this is being led by young people in ways that it was not being led by young people before. And I am really appreciating learning from them and being inspired by them. But one of the common themes that has been running through all of the conversations I've been having, all the webinars I've been listening to, because remember, we're all on a journey, no matter how long we've done this work, right? Is that we can't do it alone. We've been struggling for racial justice, educational justice, social justice for a long time. And everyone sees a dimension of that work as kind of their lane. what we've been talking a lot more about lately is the need for these kind of broad-based coalition. And so I'm wondering, Caprice, I know you've been a part of many of these coalitions. Can you talk about how we might promote these broad-based alliances that promote equity? And then how do you sustain them over time, given that as organizations, as institutions, and even as individuals, we come into the work with kind of our own agenda?
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, I actually want to start where Anthony left off with 1992, because at that time, I was working for the Transportation Authority, and on the day that the verdicts came down, I was in a room with several other elected officials and Tom Bradley. And, you know, Tom Bradley was Los Angeles's Obama figure, or said another way, Obama was the country's Tom Bradley figure, in the sense that I think as a city, we thought that here we have this incredibly powerful, unifying Black mayor who has brought us together as a city. And I think there was a widely held perception that because Tom Bradley was our mayor, we had something going right when it came down to race, or at least that was a common feeling among the white community. And seeing Mayor Bradley that day, I've never had the experience of being with someone who was so deeply and painfully moved, because he had come into his city council position and then running for mayor after having been a police officer with LAPD. And then after the riots of the 1960s, he had spent his whole life fixing this. And here it was at the end of his mayoral career, looking at term limits and realizing his time was over. And in his face and in his quiet words, there was a sense of, wow, still, you know, and lots changed since then. You referenced that was the birth of Center X, you know, and that's what's so different now, is that I think that the 1992 uprisings were a surprise. And they were a surprise after 30 years before having the uprisings of the 1960s. But people were really surprised in 1992. But what's happened since then is that there has blossomed a whole generation of Black scholars who have put their experience in the community of the very diverse Black population in the United States into real scholarship, and had formed cross-ethnic collaborations in a lot of different sectors, from education to business to financing, in ways that actually created the infrastructure so that when we've had the unrest and what I would describe more as a social revolution of the last few months, it wasn't really a surprise. For a lot of people, it was like, we knew this was going to happen, we just didn't know when. And we wouldn't have predicted the magnitude. But having listened to Patrice speak a year ago, Patrice with Black Lives Matter, a year ago, she was already foreshadowing that she didn't know what it was going to be, but that when this burst, it was going to be very big. And I think that has to do with the fact that people realized that social evolution doesn't actually come at a constant pace or with a consistent momentum. It comes in bursts. And if you're ready for those bursts, you can make the big change during that burst and then work to sustain it, right? And that's what we're seeing right now, I think, is we've got this big burst. And our job right now is to make some really big systemic changes and then work to sustain. Because in 92, I think we were caught somewhat flat-footed, and government and philanthropy made some huge investments for about 2 or 3 years. And then people forgot. They went back to, you know, the war on drugs and the war on this and the war on our own neighborhoods. And what's different this time is that we actually have created some social infrastructure. And I think that part of that creation are exactly what you're talking about, the broad-based coalitions. And having been involved in a lot of these broad-based coalitions, there are some elements that make them sustainable. And they're going to sound a little bureaucratic, but there really are, I think, three key pieces. One is that they have to be symbiotic, right? So one way to look at it is kind of the way I look at it as the leader of Learn for Life charter schools. In our charter schools, we serve mostly students who have been dropped out or pushed out of traditional public schools, not because the schools intended to push them out per se, but more that these were students who had adult responsibilities and adult challenges and significant issues that made it impossible for them to learn in the logistical context of a traditional public school. But our schools, which have a 90% success rate, would not be successful if it were not for the partnerships that we have with the juvenile justice system, with the probation department, with DCFS and foster care, with community-based organizations, with workforce investment agencies. And in total, we have over 300 MOUs with different community-based and governmental organizations. And all of these partnerships are mutual. And by mutual, I mean exactly kind of what you hit on, which is, yeah, every agency, every organization comes to it with their own agenda. And so if you were to take, for example, a workforce investment organization, they get funded based on how many students they serve. But they don't have any natural access to students. We have students that need those services. So our relationships are symbiotic. I can say to them, I know I'm going to have 200 students in, say, Van Nuys next year who are going to need WIOA supports. And they can say, okay, I'm going to save 200 of the WIOA slots that I have for your students. And it helps them because they get access to students. It helps us because our students get services. So it's symbiotic. They also have to be explicit. So symbiotic or mutual, they also have to be explicit. You have to be really clear. You're doing this, I'm doing that, so that expectations can be set. And that kind of clarity is super important for making those relationships work. It can't just be kumbaya, because, you know, God speaks differently to different people, and MOUs are all in black and white, and that makes a huge difference. And the third piece is that partners have to be accountable to each other. I can't break off the partnership just because I feel like I want to go with somebody else. You can't break off the partnership for no particular reason. We have to make our trust in our agreements, and we have to hold each other accountable. Those might sound really bureaucratic, but that's what gets the job done. And what I've discovered now, you know, over decades of doing this, is that when you make sure you have all three of those things, what you get are not bureaucratic relationships. What you get are lasting results. And you get trusting relationships that are multi-generational, that cross over organizations, and that transcend ethnic and racial and gender and also sector relationships and potential barriers. That's, you know, how you get it done. One last thing, Annamarie, I probably should say is that is, you know, I come to it as we all do, with our, you know, with the background that we have, and I come to all of this work as a white woman, and I have to be really clear as an ally that there are times when I'm not the one that should be leading, and that's a really important thing, and it's often very hard, especially for white women, many of whom work in the social sector as teachers, as community-based leaders. It's hard for white women, for myself, because we want to be mom. we want to be liked, we want to be loved, and we want peace, and we want harmony. And the hardest part about this work is for women who look like I do to step back and to say, actually, this is my fight because we're in this together. But my role right now is not to be the one out in front. I'm going to be the one that's got your back, or is raising the money, or whatever it is. And that's a really important thing for folks to figure out.
It's one of the things that folks are talking about quite a bit right now about, what are the role of white allies? And recently folks have reminded me that people of color did not create the conditions in which we live right now. We didn't. And so therefore, it's not our job to fix it. We're taking on that struggle because we have to, just to preserve our own sense of dignity and human rights. But without allies like you, Patrice, and others like you, the system is not going to change because we did not create this system. So it's on the folks who created the system to really help us to dismantle it. So I appreciate that. I appreciate the response around the broad-based coalitions. And to this point, we've been talking about educators and we've been talking about institutions and organizations invested in educational justice. And what we haven't talked about are parents and students and what is their role in, struggling with us. And so Diana Hiller asked, how can you all, and I'm posing this to all three of you, give us 3 specific actions educators can do to include parents and families as allies, co-conspirators alongside the educators that are doing this work? Jump in, whoever wants.
Yeah, okay, well, I'm gonna maybe say something. So when they tell you you're full of crap, you have to believe them. That's one of the first things, right? I mean, we've worked really hard to make sure that our students understand how to use their voice and be civically engaged. And when there's any attack on charter schools, our kids are going to be the first ones to be at the march, to write the letters, because they care about their education. They want to fight for their education. Well, now our kids know how to speak up, and they're speaking up and they're saying, well, why don't we have an ethnic studies class? And they have, their list of all kinds of things that they want to see different about the education. And it's a little, sometimes we have to just take a step back and say, well, wait a minute, we taught them to have this voice. We darn well better be listening to it. And I think that's the first thing, is having the having the openness to not allow them, but to know that actually they might be right and to follow their lead.
Anthony, Ken?
Yeah, Annamarie, I'd like to mention something as far as I know you were speaking outside the educational system, but unless the educational system starts working with teacher candidates or teacher credential candidates or in teacher education and teaches them about the racial and cultural and ethnic and gender value of people of color, by the time it gets to school, by the time they get there, it's often too late. Not that they can't change, but they're trying to survive as teachers. And so I have been saying this for the last 15 years, that teacher education is where this conversation needs to begin, and not just a conversation, but how do you measure it? How do you measure understanding someone's race and culture? And 80% of our teachers are white women across the nation. They have to be able to understand and to work with our kids of color, because we are losing our children and we can't continue to do that. The aspect of parents, I am so tired of hearing if the parents only cared, if the parents only did this, you know what? They're sending us the best kids that they have and the ones that they love. And so it is our job as educators to learn about the kids, to value what their culture and race says about them. And if you don't have one, then find one. Too often teachers say, well, I don't have a culture. I make them go back as far as it takes to pick one, because our kids bring value with them. You said something earlier about our kids being fixed. Our kids do not need to be fixed. You weren't saying they needed to, that was a term that came up. Our kids do not need to be fixed. Our kids are fine. They just need to be taught. And so if teachers want to learn about our kids and the parents, start with respect, start with teaching them with dignity. You want respect, earn the respect. It's not just given to you.
And we all want that. And Kendi said something today that I said, yes. Or was it Bettina Lev said it? She said that anti-racism is all about honoring the dignity in every single human being and respecting that. I'm paraphrasing, of course, she said it much more eloquently than that. So I really appreciate that. Mr. Jackson, I'm going to give you the last word on this.
Oh, okay. So I was just going to say that, you know, there's this piece, and I'm closer to the school site, right? And so one of the things is just being close to school communities and interacting with parents and interacting with students, but also then privileging their voices. This kind of is related to the question that Caprice addressed around the broad-based coalitions. I have a Zoom after this one around reimagining school safety, right? Basically considering the defund the police issue and things that are occurring, not just in Los Angeles. We're looking at some things in Oakland and other parts of the country. And, you know, we have activist-minded educators on the call, a couple of community activists, community coalitions represented. And I brought it up. I said, you know, we're talking about something that is so relevant to students' lives, yet we don't have a student on the call, the committee, right? I said, how about we invite some students to be a part of this conversation and get parent perspectives, because we know that parents are going to have fairly diverse sorts of ideas around, you know, the efficacy of defunding the police or abolishing them, or thinking around school police and not necessarily having them on campus, and maybe changing the safety officers and, you know, some other structural things. And everybody said, you're right. So I think first it starts with just a commitment and a willingness to engage and truly ensure that students and families, parents have agency, and that they're at the table when we're having these conversations and discussions, and they're given, you know, the ample time. They're given their time to be part of the decision making that's taking place. That's not that hard to do, unless, of course, you don't believe in you know, their voices as being important. So, and then that just becomes a different kind of work that needs to be done.
Yeah, I think one of the best examples that I've seen about that is inviting parent representatives to be part of the school instructional leadership team, which at most schools is kind of this secret society of, you know, the leaders at the school, and that recognizes that parents are leaders too. You know, it's small strategies like that that give access to parents to education and allows educators, as Dr. Magdaleno said, to learn about the families and children that they serve. That if they're not in these spaces where having these conversations, how do we leverage the community and family knowledge that is going to bring our curriculum and bring our pedagogical practices and bring our leadership practices more in line to what the needs of the community are? So we have dozens of questions. And we are almost out of time here. I want to thank you all for spending your evening with us. I want to say to the audience that we are curating all of the questions that were not responded to in one way, shape, or form, and we'll be sending them out to our panelists to see if you can get some personal responses to those. On behalf of the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies and the UCLA Women's Leadership Academy, I just want to say that based on how much there is left to talk about and extend on what you shared with us tonight, and the number of questions that we have around student voice, about how you promote agency among parents and students, about racial, the leadership fatigue that particularly leaders of color face. We've got a lot of work to do. And I know that the UCLA Women's School Leadership Academy is planning a series of webinars, and I want to thank the audience for these questions, because perhaps they can guide the next set of seminars to follow. So thank you everyone for being here. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your collaboration, and we appreciate all of the work that you do to make teaching and learning and leadership more high quality, more anti-racist, and activity grounded in love and grounded in liberation. Any last words from the panelists? We have 2 minutes.
Hallelujah.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Emery, thanks so much.
Yeah. Email
Thank
me.
you, Dr. Rose as well, of course.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rose.
All right.